climbing Jacob's ladder. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. Soldiers of the cross.
Good afternoon and welcome parishioners and guests, friends, one and all. I'm Barbara Dorich-Okara. It is my honor and privilege to serve as moderator for the inaugural Ann Barry Bonneman Symposium panel discussion this afternoon. I am pleased to present the panelists that you will hear from shortly. I won't ask them to stand. You have their biographies before you. I'll simply state their names for you and have some introductory remarks about them individually. On my far right is Bishop Michael B. Curry, Debbie Irving, the Reverend Liz Walker, Tim Wise, and Mrs. Edelman you've heard from. The theme for the discussion for this afternoon is We Still Have a Dream in Racism. Yes, we still share the dream that Dr. Martin Luther King spoke of so eloquently more than 51 years ago. But we're living in times where many of us question whether the lives of Black people are valued by those who have the legal authority to take those lives. Certainly, that and everyday slights and hardships of racist institutions have caused many of us to fear that the dream of an end to racism will forever be a dream. Thus, we come together today to put these issues before our expert panelists. With their help and your participation in the search for answers, we hope that the subtleties of 21st century racism may be clearer and that we may come to know what God would have us do to battle this sin. Now, this is how we will proceed. I will formally give some introductory remarks with regard to each of our panelists and call on our panelists to give you some preliminary remarks. Following their opening remarks, I will address some questions to them and hope that they will engage each other in response to these questions. Then it'll be your turn. We'll take questions from you to our panelists and let them hear what's on your mind. Now, let's start with Debbie Irving. Panelist Debbie Irving worked as general manager of Boston's Dance Umbrella and First Night, and later was a classroom teacher in Cambridge for 4 years, in total devoting 25 years to the nonprofit world. Her experiences in those years led her to recognize that her own whiteness presented an obstacle to grappling with racism. Debbie, you've written that waking up to your whiteness allowed you to learn how to develop from your distorted views about race, how you develop those distorted views. Is this the answer? Is awakening to white privilege a step down the road of tearing down the walls of the division between the races? One might argue, on the other hand, that many white Americans are all too aware of their whiteness and are glad of it. What do you say?
I'm sure those people exist who are clinging to their whiteness and are probably very afraid right now. But actually, there's something that's a lot more frightening to me, and that is going to the age of 48, living a lie. And that's my story. I don't know about any of you sitting out there, but if I were sitting out there looking at me, I think I would say one of these things is not like the others. And that's me. And in contrast to the panelists up here, I'm very new to this. As recently as 6 years ago, I wouldn't know what white privilege was. If you tried to convince me white privilege was a real thing, I would have thought you were crazy. And so the question and the perspective I bring and that I am trying to share through my book, Waking Up White, and that I'll share with you today is what it looked and felt like. How did I go for 48 years and not wake up sooner? And I think the easiest way to describe it is if I think of it in 3 threads that were entangled. One thread was the myth I swallowed that the playing field was level. I was absolutely sure that when I put my little hand over my heart in school every day and said the Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, I was sure that meant everyone. I'll qualify that in a minute. And so from that perspective, I could have nothing to do with racism because everything was equal. There was no racism when I was growing up, as far as I could see. It ended with the civil rights movement. And so living this strain of the lie would make me completely ill-equipped to be a part of achieving Dr. King's dream because I wasn't operating on real information. The second thread, I would say, is that at an even deeper level, somewhere along the line, I swallowed the belief that there was a natural order in the world and that white people were superior. And I've dug really deep to figure out where I got those messages because no one ever said white people are superior. But how else, if I think that the playing field is level and I start to make observations that people are living very differently, it did start to seem to me like some people were achieving more than others, and my family seemed to be doing great, and maybe that actually did mean I was smarter. You spoke about the sin of pride. I can tell you it felt awfully good to feel like I was special, and my family was special. That felt great. And the third thread I would talk about would be the social norms that held in place this belief system. And there I could go on and on. This is my favorite piece of the work, is to talk about the way we have conversations and the way we interact socially that hold racism and old beliefs about all kinds of things in place. I think the two that probably most prevented me from learning earlier was the belief that conflict should be avoided. How many times did I hear, "Don't rock the boat"? And the other thing and I was also told again and again, or overheard, that religion and politics shouldn't be discussed in polite company. Well, you're not going to get very far figuring out the way systems and structures around you work if you can't talk about politics and religion. So I didn't talk about those things in any of my white spaces, in my family, in my neighborhood, in my schools, in my social circles. And the other one was emotional restraint. That was highly valued in my white, and I want to say an upper middle class white world. And so if you went, and Tim, I've never told you this, I must tell you this publicly for the first time. Actually, a member of Stephanie Bode Ward said to me early in my journey, she said, "Have you ever heard of Tim Wise?" And I said, "No." She said, "You got to go home and Google him." So I went home and I Googled this Tim Wise guy.
That's a bad move. I'd have told you not to do that.
And I was very early in my journey. I lasted about a minute and I turned him off. I thought, that man is so angry. And I couldn't tolerate it. And I had not learned yet, this was early in my journey, that my capacity to tolerate anger was very limited, and that was a part of the culture that had held my ignorance in place. And so I think of those three things wrapped together as working on any one of those three things were ways for me to get myself out of the illusion and into a much truer, expanded narrative that includes many people's perspectives and not just those of the comfortable race class.
Now, Reverend Liz Walker, who so many of us first admired as a television news anchor, is now pastor of the historic Roxbury Presbyterian Church here in Boston. In addition to her close involvement with local church and community organizations, Reverend Walker is well known for her work on behalf of women in Sudan. The organization she co-founded, My Sister's Keeper, has constructed a new school for girls in southern Sudan. Reverend Walker, have your experiences in war-torn Sudan shaped any of your opinions about the possibility of racial healing and reconciliation here in the U.S.?
I think that my work in Sudan has indeed informed my work here in the U.S. I must say that I sometimes have to struggle with my own hope in the world, that I have seen so much inhumanity and so much pain in the world. But there is hope. There is hope in the value of people and how people can treat each other. And I saw that in Sudan. In the midst of chaos, I saw grace. And I have seen that on the streets of Roxbury, that there is grace in the midst of the mess we have made of this world.
Just a second.
My church is located in the hub of all that ails this country. Roxbury Presbyterian Church is at 328 Warren. It's a church with about 120 members. But that strip of Warren Street is just a magnification of the illiteracy, the drug abuse, the alcoholism, the incarceration, the poverty, the hopelessness. I've seen more hopelessness on that street than I've seen in Sudan. I came into this ministry as a reporter, so I had sort of a removed view of what the problem was. And I realized the longer I stay in this church and the longer I am out in the world, that a lot of this is because of my background. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about me. I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, in the shadow of Little Rock Central High School when it was being desegregated. I went to West Side Junior High School in 1960-something, but we were the second, third, and fourth kind of wave of desegregation in the South. So my childhood was just a part of struggle, and I have always known struggle. In the 7th grade, I went into my 7th grade math class in this desegregated junior high school where there were probably 20 black kids and probably 700 white kids. And Mary McClanahan, I will never forget her name, told Gary Burris to kick me. And he did. And that was the 7th grade, and that was in 1960-something, and I have never forgiven them. I hate them. If you asked me if I was a racist, I would tell you maybe not, but I think I am because of my experiences. So my point is, this is a complicated subject. It is not just an institution issue. It is a deep down inside issue. And I carry horrible, horrible pain out of my experiences. And I'm, working it out, preaching, reporting, intelligent, been to school. I still carry stuff from 1963. And I'm willing to tell you that because I think that we all carry stuff that we don't talk about. So now, move forward, I'm at this church, and I'm trying to work with this community. And I'm trying to say, well, what's the problem here? Is it racism? Is it poverty? Why? This community is less than 2 miles from this location. You might as well be in Sudan, on this street of hopelessness, on this street where I can't find healthy food, on this street where children are not being educated. It's right down the street. What's wrong? So I just want to say it, and I can get caught up in a sermon. I just felt myself kind of leaping into a sermon. I apologize.
Go ahead, preach. Go ahead, preach.
No, preach on.
Go ahead, preach. Come on.
No, all I want to say is that it is a complicated situation and has to be approached from all angles, It has to be approached just as this church is doing, and I applaud the work here to have this public conversation. It has to be approached from my neighborhood. Some of our stuff is internal. Some of our stuff we got to work on.
You're right.
I see that. It has to be approached as you walk down the street and you see somebody, you call the other, and you don't look in their eyes because you're afraid of them. I do that. So I'm just thinking that I'm learning as I go. And I'm thinking that what we have to do in Sudan and here in the United States and all over the world is something I call learn a little bit more about grace. I've got to forgive Kathy McClanahan, Mary McClanahan, Mary Burris. I've got to let that go and move on, but we all do.
Now, Tim Wise. Tim is a nationally prominent scholar, essayist, and lecturer who has devoted himself to anti-racism work since his days at Tulane University during the 1980s when he was fighting the divestment and sanctions battles regarding South Africa. We were privileged during the forum hour this morning to hear Tim discuss issues around the power of myths that have influenced negative perceptions of the poor and of people of color. Tim, you've reflected on and railed against the state of race relations in America for many, many years. Looking at the recent wave of tragedies where unarmed black men and boys have died at the hands of white police officers, can you see any hope for the transformation that Dr. Martin Luther King dreamed of?
Well, you know, I think hope is a really funny thing. And I think that it is both necessary for the sustaining of social movement, but it is also, if we aren't careful, a way in which we give away our agency. You know, if I don't hope that I'm going to eat tomorrow. I'm going to eat tomorrow. And I promise you that if I have to steal to feed my children, that will happen. I'm not going to hope for food. I'm not going to hope that my kids have food. I'm going to get them food. And so I don't want us to give away our agency in the service of the idealism of our culture and our country, as important as idealism is. I want us to make concrete that thing for which we hope. And what I see now, and what I think I really want everyone in this room to think very deeply about, is we have these young people, and I've had the pleasure and the honor of meeting many of them in Atlanta and around the country, but most recently in Atlanta, who are leading this wave of the struggle in the post-Ferguson, post-Eric Garner, post-Tamir Rice environment, this environment within which officers are gunning down or chokeholding unarmed black men and not being indicted by grand juries and not being tried by prosecutors who show no interest, quite honestly, in trying them for having done anything wrong. You're seeing these young people in a way that I haven't seen. I didn't see it when I was their age, even though we tried. It has been a very long time since I've seen this level of, not concern, because there's been concern intergenerationally for injustice for a long time, but these folks who are completely fearless. You know, when the folks were singing earlier, We Shall Overcome, and they get to that last chorus before the repeat, which is the We Are Not Afraid line, I mean, that song has always been meaningful to me, and I'm sure many of you, but that line has always sent shivers through me, because that was the line that was so meaningful to movement activists in the 60s who knew they were facing death. And what these young people are saying to us, if we're prepared to hear it, and I'm not altogether sure that we are, is we are facing death. We are literally dying, and we are prepared to die in order to be free. It is incumbent upon those of us who are older and have been at this for a minute to give our support to these young people. If it can be financial, so be it. If it is time, so be it. If it is our bodies on the line, so be it. Because what I fear, and it happens in every generation, is that young people who always lead it. Let us remember, Dr. King was 26 when he was at the head of the bus boycott. He was 39 when he was taken from us. I used to think 39 was old until I turned 40. And then I realized how incredibly young 39 was. And these young people who, I mean, it was young people that Ella Baker invested in when she called that first meeting at Shaw in 1960 that created the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Here was a woman who had been involved with the older heads of the struggle for many years, and she loved them dearly and wanted to work with them, but she said, you know, I think some of these young people know something that maybe we don't, or that we've forgotten. Maybe they have an energy that we don't, or that we have lost, and I want to see what they're and these are people who then went on to break the back of formal apartheid in the South. So I want us to trust these young people as much as we wanted to be trusted, and as much as many were trusted, because I'm afraid otherwise we end up lecturing them and we say, why don't you do it like we did it? Why you got to wear your pants like that? Why you got to listen to that music? Why you got to look like that? Why can't you be more respectable? Well, you know what? John Lewis wore a suit and tie, but we've all seen blood streaming down that suit and tie. He was respectable. It didn't matter. Dr. King was respectable. They killed him anyway. I think at some point we have to stop lecturing our young people about how to do it. We need to be willing to listen to our young people, let them tell us what they need from us. And the best lesson that I ever learned about hope and all these things that we're working for. I mean, 3 years ago, I had the distinct privilege of sitting on a stage with Angela Davis in Oakland, and there was a young person in the audience who asked us this question, and I deferred to her because I knew her answer was going to be far better, and indeed it was. And she said, you know, and I'm paraphrasing here, but not by much. She said, when you ask me what you should do, my inclination is to give it back to you and to say, what do you need from me? Where do you need me to be? Where do you need me to go? Don't ask me for the advice. You're the change. You're the people who are going to make the change. I'll be there. You just tell me where to show up. Sometimes, and I think your statement during the keynote about the difference between the Ark and the Titanic is a very important point, because those of us who are quote-unquote experts, you know, if we knew how to break the back of white supremacy, we'd have done it. We haven't done it. We're trying, but we haven't done it. So you may well, somebody in this room may be capable of coming up with at least as good, if not better answers than us. And those young black mostly, but also non-black folk of color and white allies who are in the streets right now, they may be the ones who come up with that. But unless we're there for them, and they're with them and prepared to listen to them, there isn't going to be any hope. Not the kind that actually brings transformation.
All right. As you can see, we have a multitude of perspectives here that we're going to explore it pretty shortly. Michael Curry. Bishop Curry was trained for the clergy at Yale University Divinity School and was ordained to the priesthood in 1978. Elected as Bishop of the Diocese of North Carolina nearly 15 years ago, Bishop Curry is one of the great leaders of the Episcopal Church in this country, and one of the most dynamic preachers you can be blessed to hear, and we are all testament to that today. Bishop Curry, your well-known sermon to the 2013 General Convention, from which the title of your book, Crazy Christians, is taken, tells us that as Christians, we are called to be different. You say that we are called to speak when others are silent and to stand up when others would sit down. In other words, to act crazy. Is acting crazy what it takes to move us closer to dismantling racism?
Yes.
Oh, that's the answer. Oh, now we know.
Sure. Yes. The reality is conformity to the cultural reality yields silence. If the cultural reality as it is, the nature of things as they are, is fine with you, then you need not speak. But those who would articulate a different voice, those who would speak up when others would not, are going to be labeled crazy. Now, there are a variety of metaphors for doing that.
Yes.
But that's the reality. Dr. King, toward the end, and Ms. Edelman was quite right. He was not much beloved at the time that he was killed. The criticism was intense. His own struggles within were intense. He had spoken out against the Vietnam War, against the advice of black leaders and white leaders alike. He was crazy, and he was right. Jesus wasn't killed because he was nice.
Yeah.
He wasn't killed because he had conformed to the temple reality and the Jerusalem religious establishment or to the existence of the Romans. He was killed because he spoke a countercultural, different message about a way of God and a way of... All right, you don't want me to preach. My sister already decided that. But
Okay. We have preachers.
and so the reality,
podium
and I
here.
say this, I'm a creature of the establishment. I know that. I'm wearing a purple shirt. I get it. So I understand all that. And yet the reality is, for those of us who follow Jesus, for those of us who follow the crucified one, we follow someone who talks about speaking up for those who have no one to speak for. Read Matthew 25. I ain't making it up. We follow one who talks about setting folk free from whatever has them in bondage and in slavery. I'm not making it up. Luke 4. See, the fundamentalists aren't the only one who know the Bible. There's a book. And that is an intrinsically countercultural message. And when we in the church are silent, we blaspheme in our silence. And so that's so my answer to your question is yes.
Yes. All right.
Well said, well said.
All right. Marian Wright Edelman, our keynote speaker this afternoon, has written that her parents taught her that service is the rent we pay for living. Living the legacy of service that her parents passed on to her, she has served and advocated for America's children for her entire professional life. If you had the wherewithal to make it happen, Mrs. Edelman, what would you do to bring about the kind of change that would cause every one of us, of every color, to treat every child as we would treat our own, on a personal level, on an institutional level?
Black and white define my childhood, and everything I do today comes out of my childhood experiences. People say, how do you do what you do? I said, it never occurred to me not to do what I do. I can't stand to see any child excluded from anything on the basis of race. And I became a rebel at 4 at Belk's department store when I was there with one of my public school and Sunday school teachers, and I was thirsty, and I went to the white water fountain. And she was terrified, and she jerked me away. And my little wounded ego, I went home, and my parents made it very clear that it wasn't about me, it was about them. But I became subversive. I would change the signs on water fountains wherever I went, because I did not believe in black and white water. I'm obsessed with every child getting health care, because little Johnny Harrington down the street from me in our church stepped on a nail, and he lived with his grandmama, Miss Ruth, and she got tetanus, and nobody gave immunizations. And one night in the middle of a highway on which our church and our parsonage was, there was a big accident. And we all ran out to see what was going on, and there was a migrant black family that had collided with a white truck driver. And the ambulance came, and he saw that the white truck driver was not injured, and they drove off, leaving these injured You know, these things don't go away
No.
from a childhood things. We, every day, going to our segregated schools, the white kids were here and the black kids, we would fight over the sidewalk space. And we would have knockdown drag-outs, but I just couldn't stand being told I couldn't go any place. And my mother and father and our community, though, and one of the first messages I want to say, we have got to, the external world told us we weren't worth anything. But we didn't believe it because our parents said it wasn't so, our church folks said it wasn't so, and the church was the hub of our existence.
Right.
And that was our youth leadership forum, and church doors now closed. We don't compete with the gangs and the drug dealers. We have got to make the church again.
Right.
Adults have got to begin to be examples that children can follow and who can be out there. And I was an Ella child. The first time I ever got on an airplane was to go to Raleigh to the SNCC organization meeting, and she fought that we would not become a part of SELC, that we would start our own organization. And she was always there, and what we've got to do is to get that reweaving of adult leadership and nurturing of these young people who really need support. They need to get the kind of training. I felt so lucky to have Howard Zen as my first professor at Spelman when I went there. And it doesn't take everybody. No. You know, it doesn't take everybody to start a movement. We had 30,000 folk in the Atlanta University Center when we were doing the sit-ins and doing other things, but it was only about 90 of us who went to jail. And we only had about 4 professors who supported us. That was enough. But we just need to have some caring adults who are going to be there. And we've always been lucky to do that. And secondly, you need caring adults in the homes, in the religious congregations, in the schools who tell young people it's not about you. This is not your fault that you have hand-me-down textbooks or that you have not good teachers. We need adult buffers.
Yes.
Despite what the external world said, I always knew that I was a child of God, and I always knew it was my fault, and I always knew it was my obligation to change it. Right. And so we need to be doing that empowerment for children today. And the last thing is that we really have got to go out and see what these children are living with. You got to go into these homeless shelters. I never get used to it. You got to go into these hospital emergency rooms and see the young folk wounded. You just got to see it. And we've also just got to get ourselves out of the way. I am just so sick of it. You know, Dr. King talked about the drum major instinct. It's not about us. I mean, get yourselves out of the way and see how we can begin to empower and nurture and give these young people a safe place to come and to be nurtured and to move ahead. And so, you know, there's so much that we can do, but we don't have a child problem, we have an adult problem. And I just hope the adults can get it together and provide the kind of cover from the mean arrows of the external world. And I hope that that's one of the things that will come out of here.
All right. So, members of the audience, the stage has been set. Don't forget to write out your questions. I'm going to pose a few questions to the panelists myself, but we want to hear from you. This is a joint effort. How do you envision your dream for the end of racism? What does that mean for you? I'm going to start with Debbie Irving, but I'd like others to jump in. We want to know what you'd like to see. What's the end for you?
Well, I don't know how racism could possibly be dismantled without this internalized piece that Liz talked about, and you know, she talked about her own experience. What I wrestle with is internalized superiority that will play tricks on me like that. I'm toying with which direction to go. I think I'm going to share this story of what I mean when I say my racialized mind will play tricks on me. Also, fairly early in my journey, I went to the White Privilege Conference. And I had heard wonderful things about this conference. I'd also heard wonderful things about Dr. Eddie Moore Jr., who had started this conference. I'd heard a lot about him. Couldn't wait to go. I get there, and within minutes.
Can I stop you for just a moment? I don't know if everyone here knows the concept of white privilege. Can you tell us a little bit what that means?
Well, white privilege is the opposite of discrimination. You cannot have a short end of the stick without a long end of the stick. And so, which is something I never realized. I heard a lot about the disadvantaged youth in Boston. I made no connection originally to my advantaged childhood in Winchester, Massachusetts, which was could be white if black and brown people were barred through housing and lending systems to get in there. So that's a short description.
Good one.
The White Privilege Conference does a lot to educate people like me on both the external systems and structures. It also pushes white people very hard to go inside ourselves and do this internal work. So anyway, I show up, I'm all excited for the White Privilege Conference. I'm finally there. And within minutes of arriving, I see this young, black, really dynamic-looking guy, and he has on a name tag that says Dr. Eddie Moore Jr. And do you know what my thought was? I can't believe there are 2 Dr. Eddie Moore Jr.'s.
Okay.
It was so inconceivable to me in that split second to imagine that there was a thriving national conference started by a young black male, that my mind skipped to a totally different, distorted narrative. And so that is why I think, now that's kind of a funny story, but if you think about the way that can play out, mind plays a trick on me. I'm a white man. I see a black boy. Trick, fear, gun.
Yeah.
That's not funny. And the system and structure that authorizes that. And the system and structure that does not penalize that. That's where those mind tricks get embedded into our structures and systems. That is why I think the internal piece is so important. And then I have a host of totally crazy, I'm not a Christian, I don't think, but crazy ideas that I'll save if we have time.
So, internal peace. Is anyone willing to give up white privilege if you see that as the end?
I'm so glad you asked that, because it gives me a chance to make sure everybody knows that the book I've written and the story I'm telling, it's not unique. Like, I'm not special to be telling this story. There are so many white people all over the country who are doing this. Tim knows lots of them too. People who are doing this deep internal work. There are lots and lots of white anti-racist people who fully understand their internalized white supremacy, white privilege, whiteness, and they understand the structures.
All right. So, Tim, what do you see?
I don't see as many of those people as Debbie, but I'm sure they're out there.
In terms of where you'd like to see us go, what is the end? How will we know when we get there?
Well, now that's a great question. I get that question often, or something like it. Somebody will say, well, how will we know when institutional racism, at least, because I agree that the internal piece is critical, but it's harder to assess because so much of that internal stuff is subconscious. You can't always consciously assess it. But the institutional piece, and I thought about it for years, and the only thing I could come up with, I said, I mean, there are policy things that you can propose and support, but beyond that, the way that I will know that institutional racism has been eradicated is when I can drive into any neighborhood in this country, and if there was no one outside on their porch, walking on the sidewalk, going from door to door to different stores, I would not be able to tell the likely race or ethnicity of the people who live there based on the infrastructure quality, based on whether the streets were maintained, based on whether the buildings were maintained, based on whether the schools were maintained. Because I can tell you right now, I can drive into any neighborhood in this country, and if I don't see a soul, right? If it was like that, what was that movie where Tom Cruise was in the middle of Times Square and there was nobody, Vanilla Sky, horrible film, but very interesting, right? Like he's in the middle of Times Square, there's nobody around. Imagine if you could do that in any neighborhood. It could be a black neighborhood, a white neighborhood, a Latino neighborhood, whatever it was. And putting aside, let's say that if it were a Latino neighborhood, it may have different signage. So putting that aside, but knowing who lives there just by looking at the quality of the infrastructure, which of course is publicly maintained or not, which has to do with our priorities. And I can do that right now. As long as I can do that, I know that we have not won the battle against institutional racism, because that shouldn't be possible. I shouldn't be able to tell just based on the infrastructure differential, oh, this is a white space, I'm pretty confident of that, or this is a black space, or this is a brown space. And for the most part, I think I could do that almost anywhere. So that's not necessarily the only gauge, and it's really not sufficient, but it's a start. It would certainly signify something if I could no longer do that.
What do you think, Reverend Walker?
I think it sort of aligns with what Tim just said. If I can go in my neighborhood and find a decent restaurant other than McDonald's, If I could go to a grocery store and get healthy food that I don't have to pay extra for, I think it's those. If I can see more stores that sell other stuff than liquor stores, there's some institutional something going on with that. And if I could just see people who weren't so in pain, that would be, for me, a sign.
Bishop Curry?
They've said it well. If no more kids were getting shot unnecessarily, and if we weren't building more prisons than schools,
Yes.
and if I could see that quality
Yes.
education was there for kids regardless of their parental heritage and their economic background. If that was happening, I'd know folk were also getting health care and people were also getting jobs because this society would care.
Yes.
And our policy would reflect it. And that's the dream.
Mr. Edelman?
I want to give you some of the annoying, nagging things. I look forward to the day I can be out on the street in New York City and the cab driver will stop for me and not. And I've now gotten to where I have a white staff member go about 100 feet up or 20 feet up.
Even now.
And even now, you will not believe. I want to be able to sit outside in a restaurant in the sunshine in Aspen and be reading my New York Times and not have a white woman come up to ask that her maid had left and would I like a job. And I told her I didn't think she could afford me, but if she could pay, whatever. John Hope Franklin went into his private club in Washington, D.C. that he belonged to for years and years, and somebody immediately handed them his coat. The insults still are all over the place in the assumption. And so it's these daily little insults. It's the people who walk, I remember having all the black men who said that how many people cross the street when they see you coming, or even in their own garage. And Otis Moss Jr., whom I love, told me, because he lives in suburban Cleveland, and he was emptying his garbage out in his suburban neighborhood, and the cops came and asked him what he was doing there and shone a light. I mean, there is no place that those stereotypes and the assumptions of place for black folk is not there. And so and one of the things I'd just like to say, I just hope that all of us, whenever we see a child or a person of color or a poor person disrespected, speak up. Do not be silent. Don't let people mistreat children in your presence. They need somebody as a buffer. Don't let them tell racial agenda jokes in your presence. Stare them down. Make it unacceptable in your sight. Silence is just a very bad thing. Don't give approval to the disrespect of other folk, because that's what doesn't stop it. So there's things we can do.
Well, we can probably identify a number of areas of individual racism that we see every day. A number of areas of institutional or systemic racism. But can you give me your sense of the most challenging expression of systemic racism that keeps people of color from achieving the dream? It's the worst. Let me start with you, Tim.
Well, I would say this. When there are states, and there are, that determine their prison budgets 20 years out, 15 years out, because you have to do that, right? You can't wait and build a prison at the last minute to deal with whatever crime you have. You have to plan. And when we have states in this country where lawmakers will bring up as evidence for why we need X amount of prison beds in 15 years, the third grade reading scores of black children, and this is done in this country in several states, what they are saying, and this is to me the most evil expression of systemic racism, what they're saying is they're 8 years old now, one day they will be 23, one day they will be 27, one day they will be 18, and we are not able to educate them. I mean, they've essentially said, we're not. We know what their reading scores are now. We are giving up. We are saying that we need a prison bed for them. That is their housing policy. That is their employment or jobs bill. That is the sum total of their plan for children. Now, not only black children, but disproportionately so. Yes. So to me, when you are and then when you have these private prison companies that come behind them and then say to the lawmakers, and this is happening as well, we need you to make a guarantee of X number of beds that will be filled. Now, how in the world can a lawmaker read the future and know how much crime there's going to be in 5 years so as to say we need X number of beds? Well, they don't care. What they say is, here's the deal. You got to, it's like you're a hotel. It's like you have to have an occupancy guarantee, and if you don't meet it, the state has to pay a penalty to the private prison provider. So in other words, you're paying a low crime tax. If you reduce crime, you will now pay a for-profit business whose business model has nothing to do with their own genius. It has nothing to do with their intelligence. It has to do with the commodity of human bodies, overwhelmingly black and brown over the last 40 to 50 years in particular. And that is something states are agreeing to do. They are making individual investors in these companies incredibly wealthy by locking up black and brown folks, taking them out of their communities, which then further impoverishes those communities and contributes to that ongoing cycle. And they do it fully consciously. Consciously and aware of what the impact of that's going to be. So there are others, but to me, that's the worst and most evil expression of systemic bias.
You might want to consider buying stock in the. One of my faith community, one of my faith communities in Washington is the group of saints called the Church of the Savior, and we have lots of drug addiction program and lots of former prisoners. We bought a little stock in the Corrections Corporation of America.
Oh, no.
And we have begun to go to stockholder meetings, and we've been training them, and it was
There's method to this madness.
No?
Brilliant.
And you would have thought the first time that those poor former drug addicts went in, that it was Attila the Hun raiding to take over. I mean, it was a handful of Christians just trying to begin to talk about putting some percentage of their profits toward rehabilitation. Or doing what. We need to be bugging them to death. Those companies are dependent on black and brown young people, but also on the federal government is the main funder of that for our immigrants who are held in massive detention facilities. We need to fight back by beginning to go and cause trouble and to break up this thing and replace this prison for profit pipeline with a college pipeline. But we've got to raise a ruckus. Yes. So go become stockholders and go and begin to ask questions and make them uncomfortable. And so don't let them just keep going the way they're going.
Bishop Curry, any thoughts on this?
Well, it's very similar in North Carolina as in other places. In 2010, our district lines for the state legislature and congressional district lines were redrawn. And they were essentially gerrymandered to ensure that, and I'm not even a conservative legislator, but a far right-wing legislative agenda would be imposed on the state. And Dr. William Barber, the NAACP, and others have involved all of us in the Moral Monday movements, which have been the protests to give voice. And part of the reason for the protest to give voice is that the leadership of the state legislature, both the House and the Senate, will not even talk, will not even discuss, will not even consider when, for example, when we said to the leaders of the state legislature, please come and see the people who will be impacted by your refusing the unemployment supplements. Please, come, just come with us. Just meet the people and hear some of their stories. Please come and hear some of the stories of the children and the families in public school who will be impacted because you're siphoning off money from public education and sending it through vouchers to private education. They would not even meet with us. They would not meet with anyone. They would not talk. And as a result, they've tried to decimate public education. They've redone the tax system so that poor people now are paying more than the wealthy. It's immoral, it's cruel, it's mean, it's wrong. And these are, I'm supposed to be in the Bible Belt. What happened to Jesus?
Jesus been going a long time.
And see, when that kind of thing can be done, you see, in that kind of environment, that's sinister. I'm not talking about the people now. That
That.
is evil.
Yes.
It is evil.
And in the long run, it is social suicide for short-term gain.
Yes.
And when people are actually operating against their own ultimate self-interest, they have fooled poor whites in North Carolina who are actually getting crushed by the same agenda. And yet they've bought into it thinking that if it's just hurting blacks and Latinos, they're all right.
That's all right.
And they're still poor, and they still don't have. That is a sign of something that is evil. People are doing evil and wrong, and it is ultimately social suicide.
That's right.
And those chickens will come home to roost. And so what you do is you just got to be crazy. William Barber's crazy.
Got to make it known.
And I told him he's crazy. And we need some more crazy folk to holler up until the sensible center rises up
Yes.
and begins to speak, and then maybe something.
What do you think, Debbie?
I'm thinking about both of these tied to what I saw personally play out in schools. And I really struggle with how much is conscious and how much is, I don't know how much of it is consciously evil. The impact is evil, and that's what matters. And what I mean when I say this is that I taught kindergarten first and second, and I was in the schools more than that as a volunteer and a parent. And I probably saw 10 kindergarten classes become first grade classes, become second, and so forth. And it was almost as if there was a conveyor belt, a predetermined conveyor belt that set white children on a path of being excited and empowered, and white families more fully engaged in the schools. And the black and brown children, I watched the light in their eyes get dimmer and dimmer. And I was one of their teachers. I was one of the people doing this to them.
But what was happening? What was going on?
What was happening, there are
dim
lots
that
of things
light?
happening. There are studies now that show that when black children come to a public school, very often their heart rate is already elevated as they get to the front door. They're already in flight or flight because of fear of being in a white space. 85% of the teachers in this country are white. That does not match our student population. And the place that I was coming from, full of all these sick, internalized ideas about actual superiority. Think of how that actually played out in my classroom. I was probably being very, very patronizing without meaning to be, not knowing. I was trying to help and fix people without really understanding the circumstances or that old mindset of mine. And yet, I could relate very easily, seamlessly to white children and white families. And so I was a part of the problem, alienating people, sending the signal that, Liz talks about looking at someone and not wanting to make eye contact. Well, there's a good reason for that, because there were thoughts going through a lot of white people's heads.
And those poor little black kids see that.
Of course they
pull
do.
away.
Yes. And not only do they see that, but their white peers in that classroom see that. And so in every little classroom in America, I know there are a lot of people working hard on this, but I had the best of intentions. And yet, what I was reproducing in my classroom every day was whiteness. It was white superiority. And it's the last thing I thought I was doing. And that's an evil impact from a good intent.
Can I just
And,
ask a
that's, and this whole zero tolerance idea feeds into the school to prison pipeline.
Yes, Mrs. Edwin, you had an idea.
One of the most important things we're doing is something called Freedom Schools that we took out of the Mississippi Summer Project in 1964. And the white volunteers came down, and we had to have something for them to do and to be safe, and we wanted to keep children and old people out of harm's way. And so we created a curriculum of Freedom Schools. I went to Greenwood, Mississippi, and I heard Pete Seeger saying, under an old oak tree where our Freedom Tree school was, with old people and young people, where they were teaching the kids French and black history and other things they didn't get in the Mississippi public schools. Little boxes, little boxes, little boxes. I will never forget it. We've taken that Freedom School concept from '64, and we've put a very well thought through, integrated reading curriculum with books that have children in them that look like them and that give our children hope. They are taught by college students, mostly 95% black, from their communities, so that they can see what they can become and that what they see on a daily basis. And I am so pleased that many of these black and Latino young people are going into teaching, so that the only people they see in schools are not the janitor and the cook. And so that these young people, and I'm trying to get everybody to stay out of law school and to go into teaching in the black community. That is where the new, that is that we've got to reclaim our children. And we've got to go in there, and we've all got to pay attention. 90% of the books that are coming out today from all of our publishers, and we're having a symposium on this next year, are for white children. Black, Latino, Asian, Latin American children don't. We've got to begin to look at who is sending the messages about our history, about our books. We need to bring the society now into sync with the reality of who our children and our futures are, so that they can see themselves. But education is the new bastion. If you are illiterate and can't read, you're sentenced already to social and economic death. So we've got models. We've got over 200 freedom schools. Start one. Go to the website, learn more about it, but figure out how we can begin to get them in every church. Let's bring Vacation Bible School into Freedom School. I mean, but the point is that we've got to reclaim and give our children a buffer, and begin to sort of talk and organize parents about how they can speak up and make a big noise, because this is the most dangerous time since slavery. Because if you take 80% illiteracy in 4th and 8th grade, and the dropout rates, with the prison going, with the school discipline policies, with the lack of an early childhood system, when we know what happens in the first 3 years of life, and we're still fighting about that, and that's one of our top priorities. If we could all agree on getting one big thing done for children a year, if we could just all say we're going to do one thing for children while we do our little thing. But children are not on most people's agenda. It's the hardest, and they don't vote and they don't lobby. And we really have got to sort of say, hey, adults, you know, this is about your children and about your future. And the whole civil rights movement was premised on getting your children a better life than you had. And I loved it. I'm going to let Miss Amelia Borkin have the last. I took my grandchildren, who were 9 and 11 last year, 2 years ago, down to Selma to read to the march. And you need to do these kinds of things. You need to take your children out and tell them the stories and let them see. But the best speech of the whole weekend was Miss Boynton sitting in her wheelchair. She was 104, and everybody was coming there to tell her, "Oh, we all standing on your shoulders, and we just, we don't know what we would have done without you."
Can you tell us who?
Miss Amelia Boynton was the one. If you go see Selma, but she was a bull. She was on voter registration. She really opened up and challenged the exclusion of blacks from Alabama rolls. But we were all just giving her great praise. She said, "Y'all coming in here and y'all talking to me about how you stand on my shoulders." She said, "Get off of my shoulders. Get out here and build the next path of the road to the future. Don't look back. You go forward." And so we have to have a new movement. And it's got to be a transforming movement, and it has to be about poverty and about children. But that's our challenge, all of us. And so I just hope we'll go forward with that.
So it seems that we really shouldn't abandon some of those old techniques and bring them back, where
we need to adapt them.
Adapt them today.
Much more complicated.
Yes. Yeah.
Much harder to find your enemy. Much more complicated. And one of the other things I just hope, because Dr. King was right, that we're all adopting the values of the broader society. We tend to confuse personal access of going to the White House or going to have a meal with a senator with community empowerment. It ain't about us, but we go there and we said, but we've got to get out here and organize. And nobody's going to do it from within the political process. Politicians respond to what they hear from the outside, so we have got to hold people accountable. And Barack Obama cannot, but I'm glad he's there, but we need to push him, we need to push the Congress, and this is going to be a terrible Congress. This is going to be a terrible Supreme Court year. It's going to be a terrible continuing political gerrymandering year. We are at war for the future and conscience of this nation, and we've got to step up to the plate, or we're going to keep going backwards.
You're right.
All right. Could we go back to the term white privilege and how it relates to unequal access to power? Tell us your thoughts on that, Tim.
Well, I think Debbie gave us a really good working understanding of it. all I'll add to it is this. I think, and this hopefully will be of some assistance when you will go forward from here and do as I know you will, which is engage your friends and your colleagues and your neighbors and people you work with. I think the mistake, it's not a mistake, it's a problem when you talk about an issue that is as emotionally weighty as the term privilege. Because after all, you hear that term, I hear that term, the first thing that most of us imagine is being spoken of is great wealth. Well, that's one kind of privilege, and most people don't have it. We live in such an economically divided country that for most of us, if you were to suggest we had that kind of privilege, we would look at you pretty sideways, and with good reason. We don't have that for most of us. But when we talk about white privilege, or when we talk about male privilege, or when we talk about straight privilege, or when we talk about cisgendered privilege, or when we talk about able-bodied privilege, and you can think of other examples, all we're really talking about, and I say all, not because it's a minor thing, but because it's a major thing and yet an easier thing to explain, is we're talking about the day-to-day ability to go through your routine, whatever that is, work routine, going to the mall, going jogging down the street, driving to the store, going to the classroom to learn, whatever it is you do, with one less thing to think about today. That is to say, that if I'm able-bodied, I don't have to worry about how I'm going to get into this building or how I'm going to get out or what I'm going to do if there's a fire, God forbid, because I have the privilege, the psychological now, not necessarily economic, the psychological privilege. Now, that's not to say that doesn't bleed over into money. It does. It has material consequence. But first and foremost, white privilege means as a white person, I'm driving down the pike tonight when we get done here. I'm going to West Hartford to do another event, and I'm going to speed. I'm in a church. I can confess my sins before I've committed them. I'm gonna break the law. That's not much of a sin. I mean, it's pretty minor league, but I'm gonna break the law. And I'm not gonna do it on purpose. It's just that I know that I will probably go over the speed limit by about 10 miles an hour, maybe 8 if I'm being real careful. Maybe 15 if I drift off, you know, and don't think about it. My point being, I'm not really worried. Not to say white folks never get tickets, because I've gotten them, but I got a lot more warnings than I got tickets. And I have a feeling that I'm not gonna get stopped, and I know that if I do get stopped, it's because I was speeding. It's not because some state trooper on the side of the road saw me in this rental car that I have, which is this late model SUV, very nice, very tricked out, very nice. He didn't see me and go, oh, white dude, I better stop him, and then when I'm done, I need to search and see what's in his car. That's white privilege. It's the ability to go through life with one less thing to sweat. And in a society like this, that is so hyper-competitive, having one less thing to think about today gives me a huge edge. And if I've got and here, we all got some privilege. Every one of us in this room has got some kind. So think about where you have advantage and how blind you can sometimes be to that. It's like that movie, The Matrix, where, you know, Neo is offered the blue pill and the red pill. If he takes the blue pill, he can go back to sleep and remain oblivious to the way the world really works, or he can take the red pill and have enlightenment. He takes the red pill and suddenly he sees the stuff he never saw. White privilege is the blue pill in an IV drip stuck in your vein. You don't even know it's there, and it renders you oblivious to the reality that these black and brown folk in this country live every day. That's white privilege.
All right.
That's good, Tim. Yeah,
That's terrific.
that's very good.
But will anyone give up a privilege? Is anyone willing to fall back?
Well,
If resources are perceived to be limited, is this a wall that we can never penetrate?
Well, I think if they understand what many have already said here today, which is this may be short-term gain, but it risks the whole society. So I think white supremacy is toxic for the planet. I think white supremacy is behind resource exploitation. The reason we look at the Arab world and say, how did our oil get under your sand? Right? That is white Western privilege. So we go to war for that, and we exploit resources that risk all life on planet Earth. So it's a benefit in the short run. In the long run, it will kill you.
Right.
So I think people can give it up if they understand that it will kill them. I don't think they're going to understand that right away, but that's the message. That's the message.
That's good. Yeah.
You know, I think about the message. I think one institution that needs a lot of pushing is the media.
Yes.
Because
Media.
the messages that we get out there now are just insane. I don't know what happened. I got into television because I thought this was about changing the world, and we sold out somewhere a long time ago.
Yeah.
And it's not all Fox News, but it's kind of all going that way.
Yeah.
And you know how you watch Fox News and after about 30 minutes, you turn it off, you just want to slap somebody? You're just mad. You're mad because that's the message. The message is us or them. That's the message. Somebody's got to be an enemy, right? Somebody's got to be the other. If it's not us, it's people in the Middle East or the little black kids, and everybody's got to have an enemy.
But people are listening to Fox.
I got to tell
They're
you.
listening, and others are becoming more like Fox.
And they want to
I
slap
used to like
us.
CNN, but CNN
But that's-
has the need to be a little foxy
Because
every now and then.
because people are watching Fox,
Yeah.
and
They're
that's the
watching it.
dollar, and that's the conspiracy. There's a conspiracy out there. There's a message that people are buying that we need not buy, but I'm afraid that we're buying into it.
Can I just say one other thing? here?
Sure.
Because I wouldn't deny anybody their first million or 10 million or 100 million, of even first billion or two. But we've got to still, if there are no hungry children, and if there are no homeless children, and I don't understand why if you've got 2 billion or 3 billion, you got to come back and ask for more tax breaks. And I had, and you've got to pay attention. And God bless you for Elizabeth Warren, okay?
Oh, yes.
Because they're in the process of trying to dismantle Dodd-Frank. 2 months ago, I was sitting up there in the budget committee when they were trying to, and the budget tax people the committee had passed a $400 billion extension. You're going to see it again in the budgets this year. A $400 billion permanent tax cut for rich corporations, okay, with no pay-go. The rule is you're supposed to be able to find an offsetting cost for that. And we had a little foster care bill to sort of get foster care children the little the subway tickets of transportation to go play. And it was like less than $100 million, but we didn't have a pay-go for it. So they said we could not afford to do this little foster care bill, but we could give away the house to the folk who've already stolen the house, most of the house. And we've got our little money back, but that $400 billion is going to show up again. We've got to, there is no level of decency here that will say we will not take from the weakest and give more and more to the top 1/10 of 1% and the top 1%. And I don't know what it's going to take for us to get up in arms about this. People who've got $3 billion don't need new tax cuts. We don't need to be subsidizing yachts. We don't need the level playing field for advocacy for children and for the poor. I can't deduct our skyboxes or our media campaigns. It is so unfair. Both the rules of the game to fight, but secondly, the way in which power never seems to get enough. And so we've just got to wake up and not let those that have already, we're back in the Gilded Age, get more. So I just hope we're going to pay attention to the budget process, and I hope we're going to really, really speak up.
If we don't do it now, when do we do it?
We won't have nothing left to do about it.
And I think that that's a really important part of white privilege. One of the biggest white privileges is the choice to not speak up and to not have to feel or think about privilege. For a white person to step into this work, I think it often feels like more of a choice than it does for people who are thinking about their own families. And yet, we are all family, as you spoke about today. We are not separate, and it will all come home to roost. So I really encourage white people. For me, it was terrifying to start standing up in social circles and professional spaces and saying, this isn't fair. There's stuff I really want you to know that I don't think you know yet. And I think if you knew it, you might feel differently. And you talked, Ms. Edelman, about squandering wealth, and in your talk about that being the road to hell would be squandering wealth. I feel that I'm not going to get into hell or heaven, but I think a lot of us squander our privilege. And I think we can leverage our privilege by speaking up as white people in ways that Black and brown people cannot. So I would add that.
And yet, I mean, just in the same vein, I really do think, Ms. Edelman kind of said the same thing. I really do think, just from the experience of North Carolina and the Moral Monday movement, I don't know who it was, but somebody in the 19th century said the only thing necessary for evil to prosper is for good folk to do nothing, to say nothing. One of the learnings from the Moral Monday movement is we've not won the battle, we've not won the war, but when folk began to speak up and speak out, and as more people began to speak up and speak out, and as more people, more and more, that while it was seemed like it was the fringe in the early days. I was telling folk at dinner last night, I've got a couple clergy who kind of regularly get arrested for various things for protest, and when one of them called me, I said, well, what is it now? You know, I didn't know. But when it moves from folk who are always hollering, because they're the John the Baptists, they're always crying in the wilderness, but then it moves to school teachers. Then it moves to business folk, and the Moral Monday movement became a movement where there were thousands of people on the mall of the Capitol in Raleigh, and they were Christian, Jewish, Muslim, they were black, white, Latino, Native, Asian, and most of them had jobs, and they couldn't dismiss us. Because suddenly it wasn't the fringe, it was the center. The silent center began to speak up. And public opinion polls in North Carolina have actually changed. We got a different government, but public opinion is not where the government actually is. Unfortunately, they've gerrymandered the district, so it's hard to get it to crystallize. But that's all right. If you just keep at it long enough. Keep at it long enough. Evil is not going to win.
Amen.
Wrong is not going to win.
Amen.
And that's why we come to church. Because everything out there, go to synagogue, mosque, something, because everything out there tells you that wrong and injustice is going to win. It's stacked against us, but it will not win. And
Bishop Curry, let me play devil's advocate here. If I can say
it would take the devil to argue with that.
There are no devils here, but journalist Myrlie Evers Williams, the widow of Medgar Evers, says that today racism flows in the veins of America. Do you agree with that? Does that mean that nothing can be done and that young people will always inherit racist institutions and communities?
I was with her and Jack. We were together in Jackson, and I heard her say that. I think she's dead right. Another metaphor that may be helpful is that America is addicted to racism. And so we must have a 12-step method. To understand we are addicted. You don't ever completely disabuse yourself. You're not completely, but that we are in recovery. We need to find the way to recovery so that we control, because there's always going to be mutations of self-centeredness and the hubris and pride we were talking about before. And it's going to take the form of racism. It's going to take the form of classism, sexism, homophobia. It's going to put somebody down to puff myself up.
But that's a mutation. That's not the way things have to be?
No. Just like you may have an addiction issue, but you can learn the disciplines and you can learn the internal spiritual strength and source of those strengths that you can keep that thing in check.
Or let's even say, we'll just take her analogy and say she's right, and I think she is, and I like yours as well. Racism's in the veins, cholesterol's in your veins. Get you a beta blocker, and the movement is the beta blocker or whatever it's called that interrupts that. I mean, cholesterol will kill you if enough of it builds up in plaque in the veins and heart and arteries. But there are ways to deal with that, and so it may be very much embedded, and I think it is physically, spiritually, economically, culturally. But the movement is the antidote or medicine to that that minimizes the damage. It doesn't go away, and you may have to be on that medicine your whole life, but eventually, it doesn't kill you, and it doesn't kill the society. So
So Reverend Walker,
I was going to say, this has been said before, but you talked about the young people inheriting it. The young people they're going to change it, and that's what we've said, and that's where the hope lies, I think, in this next generation that's already, protesting. A young woman the mayor fired a young woman because she was willing to, protest racism on the 93. I'm just saying they're putting themselves out there. They're sacrificing already.
They're putting their bodies out there.
Yeah.
But they need their Ella
Absolutely.
Bakers and September Clarks. We need our strategy. We need the nonviolent training.
Absolutely.
And so we adults have got to get there and empower and support
them.
Give them the skills that they need.
Yes,
We never felt we were alone, that we had, and it didn't take a lot of adults. And most of them were trying to discourage us, but that's, again, let me just come back to thank Dr. King. Because when we were just, it was after the sit-in movement and the Klan, we decided we were going to do a march in Atlanta, and the Klan said, as y'all come, we're going to block you and lock you, attack you. And we met with our college presidents, all of whom, and they brought the chief of police in, all of whom said, we're not sure we can guarantee your safety. And so we listened to them all, but we decided we were going to march anyway. And the college president, I ain't never been that lonely in my life. We went out there the morning of the march, and there wasn't nobody, about seven of us, wasn't nobody out there because we went to chapel before we went out there, and my president got up and told the kids not to go. They double-crossed us. They thought we had a deal. They double-crossed us. But at any rate, the bottom line is we decided we were going to just go. But there was nobody out there. But then we started hearing the students of Morris Brown singing and coming. And the president of Clark College had locked the kids in the dormitory. They jumped out the second floor window. Bottom line is that thousands of us filled up that and went over and marched, and Chief Jenkins kept his Klan behind the lines. And we went over to the Wheat Street Baptist Church. And who did we see on the front chairs? There was our 5 or 6 college presidents welcoming their students that they tried to keep in the dormitory. But more importantly, Martin Luther King flew up from Montgomery to be there to encourage us. And when he walked in, we went wild, the place went wild, but we had the few, and it doesn't take a lot, a few adults who encouraged us and made it clear that we were doing the right thing. And that's what we need. We need to find those few adults. So.
This history is so important.
It's so important.
My son, you struggle so that your son doesn't have to go through what you go through, but the problem with that is my son has no connection, right, or had no connection to struggle. Ferguson, New York happened with the killings, and he's beginning to get agitated. Then he sees Selma. Oh my God, he's like a born-again revolutionary.
I'm so glad.
And I've been trying to tell him all the time, but now he gets it. So see Selma and make sure a young person sees Selma.
Yeah, that's good.
We're going to pause for just a few minutes and see what the audience has to say. So just 1 minute, let's see what their questions are. I have a question for Debbie. What is a strategy to get an honest, open, non-hateful dialogue about race into the public arena or in mainstream political debate?
Oh, I was hoping it was going to be a strategy in a personal setting, because I had just the right answer for that. I'll tell you, I think this idea sounds preposterous, but I'm just going to put it out there. I really feel like there should be a nationwide campaign about what racism is, how it works, how toxic it is for our planet, for our people, for our future. There have been billboard campaigns about smoking, about driving drunk. Racism is bad for you. Why aren't we doing a campaign about it? I feel like there needs to be a major national awareness raising. And I'll answer the interpersonal one because I think it's so important. If you want to get this conversation going, if you're trying to take this idea to a national or a political level, it's going to have to start with a personal conversation anyway. These conversations, I find, are so effective if you start asking the person questions. Find out where someone is in their own belief system. Often when someone hears their own dissonant, conflicted thinking, they'll start waking themselves up.
I have a question for Bishop Curry. Have we given our religious leaders a pass? Jesus tells us the poor are always with us. Shouldn't our clergy, all denominations, be raising the alarm for housing, health care, education from pulpits, at state houses, boardrooms, bishops? There is enough money and power in this room at this moment, and access to more money and power to make substantive change and to improve Black lives in Boston now. To me, the real discussion is about good leadership from clergy. What do you say about that?
Yes.
Good answer.
Well, and to be sure, we do need leadership. You know, I mean, you do need leadership. But the truth is, we only, those of us who are Christian, we only have one Messiah.
Okay, wise.
And therefore, to expect that our leaders will be messianic and will be capable of magically motivating all of us is basically to pass the buck. Now, I have high expectations of leaders and myself as one. But the truth is that, I'll just speak for Christian folk, if you're Christian and baptized, you have already been commissioned to engage the struggle against racism. You don't need your priest or preacher to teach you how to do that. Now, we must, on the other hand, create environments. And we struggle with this in North Carolina, and of environments in which, if the word does not become flesh, it doesn't mean anything. And so we as clergy must find ways to help our folk understand that this word of God, these teachings of Jesus, must be lived. And if they're lived, how do we do it? Now, we don't tell people how they all do it, but we have to create an environment where people are studying the scriptures and trying to figure out how they can live that out in the world and how they can affect the society so it reflects those values that we have. That is our job. That's Christian formation and education. It's not just talking about how you get to heaven. It's talking about that. But it's more than that, how you make heaven here on earth. And so we have work to do, but don't just pass the buck.
We all have to do it. Tim, this question is for you. It says, speak about why there are so many Black and brown boys and men in jail. That is, policing and arresting policies.
Well, we know what it isn't, although many think it is. If you asked a lot of people in this country that question, they would say, well, it's because they're the ones who are doing the crime. But here's the reality. I mean, 1964, 1965, so roughly 50 years ago, 2/3 of the people locked up in this country were white, 1/3 were people of color. Today, it's 2/3 people of color, 1/3 white. That is not because white folks around 1966 said, wow, we've been doing all this crime, we ought to stop. And it's not because Black and brown folks said, well, now, if they're not going to do it, maybe we ought to do it. It isn't that we shaped up and flew right, as my mama used to say, and it's not that people of color as a percentage of all crime really went up. In fact, people of color crime rates have dropped dramatically, contrary to popular belief. Violent crime rates in Black and Latino communities down by about half in the last 25 years, roughly. So it isn't that. It is because the mechanisms, and this may seem cynical to some, but I honestly believe there's a reason that the incarceration rates begin to spiral as the civil rights victories take hold, because you had these mechanisms of social control you didn't have anymore. So now you don't have the right to discriminate. You don't have the right to keep people from certain housing. You don't have the right to keep them from voting. If you want to maintain a system of white supremacy, not because you're part of a conspiracy, but because systemically it works for you, how do you do that? You police certain folk, not other folk. And you know, we know that the disproportionate reason why folks are locked up is for nonviolent drug offenses. We also know, because all the data tells us, that white folks use drugs and possess drugs and sell drugs at rates that are virtually identical to the rates at which people of color possess and deal them and use them. But we're not getting arrested. And since I'm in church, as a matter of formal confession, not for sins I'm going to commit, but those I have committed, I know that if being incarcerated were just about breaking the law, y'all would have to have a different panelist up here, because it wouldn't be me. I wouldn't be, and for those who tried to rationalize the killing of Mike Brown because, oh, he smoked weed. Well, if that's all it takes to get shot, again, you would need a different panelist up here. I would have been shot many, many years ago. And so I think that's the answer. We have a over-policing based on perceptions of who is dangerous that do not comport with who is. I've asked police officers, what is the first thing you think when you see a young black male in a nice car in your neighborhood? And virtually every officer, including the black officers, will respond, probably a drug dealer. I will then say, what happens when you see a young white male, same age, same kind of car, in your neighborhood? And they will inevitably say, including most of the black officers, spoiled little rich kid, daddy probably bought him a car. If you can admit to me the only difference there is color and you see them different, then you're going to treat them different.
Yes. And from the perspective of a retired judge, it's discretion. That's the short answer.
That's it.
Prosecutorial discretion, police discretion. And it's not about the type of crime necessarily. It's about the choice to give some people a pass and the choice not to give others a pass.
Have you read the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander?
Yes.
So
Yes.
she speaks of conspiracy.
Yes.
That, you know, that the war on the Contras and bringing the drugs in and who was taking the drugs in the 80s.
It's all tied. The money that was available in the 80s.
That's a
for
systemic issue.
Yes, very much so. Let me move. Okay, we have a question for you, Mrs. Edelman. We have many questions. It's so hard to choose from here.
Give them to somebody else.
All right. Well, let's go to Liz Walker. Comment about maybe being racist. What is your definition, I guess, of racist or racism?
It's maybe being racism is hoping I'm really not, but seeing Mary McClanahan in a lot of people, and seeing Gary Burris in a lot of people, and flinching when I hear a Southern white voice, because that was on the radio when I grew up, and they were the ones in the, you know, they were on the radio talking about Christianity, and they were also the same voices talking about niggers. So having, so basing a lot of stuff on perception and profiling.
Right.
That's what it is for me.
All right.
But I hope that Jesus will free me of this.
Yeah.
Free us all of this.
He will. He will.
I'm very hopeful.
All right. This is a question for you, Debbie. Oh, there's so many. I should ask you to pick the ones you want to answer.
Wow.
We won't be able to get to many of them. I'm trying to give a variety. How do you define white allyship? Is it more important for white people to get out of the way and let people of color take the lead in dismantling racism and racist institutions? Or should white people take a more active role in leveraging their privilege to create change?
What a good question.
Yes.
You know, so what makes the role of the white ally difficult is in any system of oppression, you have a double bind. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. So as a white person, if I don't speak up or if I don't speak up enough, I may have done the wrong thing. If I speak up too much, I may have just stolen airtime that a person of color was about to fill with something remarkable. So I think a white ally needs to be prepared to make lots of mistakes and learn from them. But I've been thinking lately that a slogan that would be great for white people would be stop, drop, and listen. You know, when we, as a K-1-2 teacher, you know, there's the stop, drop, and roll if there's a fire. I feel like the most important thing white people can do is listen and get out of the way and know when actually is the right time to step in. And that's just a messy, lifelong learning process. There's no perfect way to be. What I actually, someone advised me, don't say you're a white ally, say you're striving to be in alliance.
Right. This is a question I don't know who it's for, but would anyone simply comment on it? The racism in sports teams' identities, schools, professionals, teams continues, such as the Cleveland Indians, the Washington Redskins. Why does Boston not challenge this? And I suppose why not just Boston in particular, why don't we or groups challenge this? Anyone want to take that on?
Well, you know, I've spoken about this a couple of times. I think there is a common perception on the part of those who are not themselves the target of a stigma, even if they're quite well intended, to have absolutely no understanding not only of the historical meaning of certain terminology, but the lived experience of those who are targeted by that, and then to try to excuse it as happened. I mean, I was speaking at University of Illinois several years ago when they were having a debate over Chief Alinowick, who was the mascot, if you will, of the University of Illinois. And all the white folks, not all, but the vast majority, were defending Chief Alinowick because it's tradition. It's tradition. Actually, it isn't an Illini tradition to march around in headdress. Those are, that's a Plains Indian headdress. These were not Plains Indians. So it's actually not the right tradition. So you don't know your history. And it was actually a dance and a parade, parading around that was crafted by the Boy Scouts in 1913. It had nothing to do with the nation. But what I said in response to them, because I knew that if I just went and beat them over the head and called them racist, which I was so tempted to do, but I knew that wasn't going to work. And so what I said is, you know, tradition is a choice we make. Tradition is not, there are lots of traditions. We have them in our families. Sometimes we pass the good ones down and we get rid of the dysfunctional ones if we're lucky. And the fact that we have a tradition of caricaturing indigenous people does not mean that we have to maintain a tradition of, I said, if you want to honor, because that's what I said, we're honoring them. You want to honor them, I'll tell you what you do. You know, Chicago has one of the largest indigenous Native North American people communities in this country. Why don't you go start offering scholarships to those young people? You want to honor them. You want to honor them, have an indigenous Native North American studies program on your campus. You want to honor them, stop making fun of them, and understand that there is a tradition of white folks standing up against the marginalization of indigenous peoples and other black and brown folks. So why don't you join that tradition? There is a solidarity tradition going back to the colonies of white folks actually running away to indigenous communities which they preferred to their own. So why don't you join in that struggle and make that your new tradition? We don't have to get rid of tradition. We just have to decide which ones we're going to pick. Right now we're picking the wrong ones when we do that.
That's right.
Yeah. Question for Mrs. Edelman. I was born in 1962, so the civil rights movement took place as I was a child. How has racism changed or progressed since then, and has it taken on new meaning?
I think it has changed in multiple ways. I think that we've heard about what happens when we've desegregated, but we didn't desegregate the faculty and the habits. And so you had children without role models. One of the things that helped me during the segregated days, even though we had the hand-me-downs, books and the hand-me-downs, everything, our teachers were our public school teachers, were our Sunday school teachers, were our Girl Scout leaders, and we had this community, and they were absolutely committed to making sure that we learned what we had to learn. And we've got to really now re-people our classrooms with people who are just going to make sure that children get what they need and are empowered. And that we get bad teachers out of the classroom. I don't care what color they are. I don't care who they are. Children have too much negativism in their lives to go to school and have that reinforced. And so we have got to begin to kind of redo that. But I think that it's more economic. The economics has gotten worse. I mean, we've got the largest gap between rich and poor and wealth inequality. We've got 14.7 million poor children. We made a huge difference in the poverty program, but it all has been going backwards. And I mean, the idea that we've got 45 million Americans, we had 10 to 15 million less when Dr. King died calling for a Poor People's Campaign, that we've got 14.7 million poor children. We got as many extremely poor children. I think Massachusetts' population is 6.7 million. We've got 6.5 million extremely, half the poverty level. But you've just seen the structural economic changes that have just left those who are already behind further behind, and there seems to, and the tax policies are more unjust, and the voice, because those who are able to walk through the gates of opportunity forgot those that were left behind, too many of them. And so what we have got to understand is we're all in the same boat again, and we've got to get children on the agenda so that we can break this backward cycle. But the economic inequality is disastrous, and that disproportionately affects people of color. And so that's why we're getting, we're losing all the gains that we made in many ways. We know what to do. And next week, we're going to issue a new report on ending child poverty in America. We don't need to change any laws. It's far more expensive to keep children poor, to have them drop out of school. Bob Solo, our wonderful MIT professor and recent Presidential Medal of Freedom winner, we've done 3 books on the cost of child poverty. We cannot afford child poverty in America. It's too expensive. $500 billion a year in foregone productivity. And we'd like to just start with a down payment. Our report will show us that we can do it for about 1/5 of that. We can get rid of a majority of our children and wipe out. So we know what to do. It's about political will, political voice, and loving our children enough and loving our country enough to try to make us get back to a modicum of decency, but it's going to be our undoing. So we know what to do, but it's the poverty, it's the economic inequality.
Now, Bishop Curry, this question is for you. It says very simply, what can we do about our fear?
About what?
Fear. What can we do about our fear? Fear to act or fear to
That'd be crazy.
Well, the truth is fear does serve a necessary purpose. What we ought to fear, I think we need to redirect it. Redirect it to what we need to really fear. To fear that our failure to invest in children now is going to pay negative dividends on down the road. To fear
that more.
That if we disenfranchise whole populations of people, you will destabilize a culture, a society. Fear that if we let the most vulnerable in our society increase in numbers, eventually they're going to find a way to eat. They're not going to starve.
Right.
And we are going to have social disruption and social fear that if, I'm not preaching, but you see what I'm saying? I think fear does have a natural, appropriate focus if it is toward the right thing. It protects us from danger. We need to be afraid of injustice and its consequences, afraid of the consequences of racism for all of us. It's not a black thing. It's not a Latino thing. It's a human thing. That we all lose if we don't find a way for all of us to win. It's really that simple. It's not, y'all are right. It's not that complicated. It's hard.
It's hard to do.
It's hard.
Hard to do.
But it's not that complicated.
Tim, here's a question for you. How or what caused you to think and act so sincerely and truthfully about racism?
Why does that always?
You always get this question?
And I always say I got dropped on my head. Next question. No, you know what? Look, I'm very, very fortunate to, this may seem strange to some, but those of us who are from the South know the truth of what I'm about to say. I think I'm very fortunate to have grown up in the South, because I think that to be white and from the South makes it virtually impossible for you to not know that race is the background noise of everything that happens in this country.
Right.
I think you can be white and from the Northeast, the Midwest, the West Coast, the Pacific Northwest, and think, now it's the background noise of your life too, but you don't have to think about it all the time. I did. That doesn't mean that white Southerners have it all together, as you have well reminded us. However,
You do, though.
well, see, now I'm trying to suppress that accent because I don't want to freak you out.
I have a twitch. I don't know.
I'm trying to suppress it. I'm not doing a very good job
Be
at this moment. But in any event, look, I was blessed to be in a family where, battle lines were very clearly drawn. My family was on the right side of those battle lines, and they made very conscious decisions that I think we as parents have to make. And this goes back to some of the parental guidance and the elder guidance that Ms. Edelman was talking about. My mom made the decision, the conscious choice, to send me to a preschool where I would be in the minority. I went to Tennessee State University for preschool in 1972 when I was 3.5 years old. I was one of 3 non-black kids in the room. That meant 2 things. One, it meant most of my peers would be black children. And so that meant, unlike a lot of white folk, because we all say we have black friends, we usually are lying, but I didn't have anything but black friends. Yeah. And it meant that the authority figures in my life were often black women who ran that program, who were the teachers, the caretakers, the directors of the program. So what did that mean? See, if you're 3 and you're white and you're being subordinated to black authority in 1972, or even today in 2015, that'll have an effect on you. Because 20 years later, when I'm doing public housing organizing in New Orleans and I have black women telling me, hey, this is what my life is. Yeah. I'm not going to be the guy who looks at her and says, are you sure about that? I think you might be seeing things, right? Because I was trained early on to trust that folks know their life better than I know their life. And so if I'm trained, and so my mom gets the credit for that, the mentors that I met in New Orleans along the way are implicated in that. And so I take very little credit for it myself, but it's the thing I think that makes all of us who we are, the people who come into our lives, which means if we want other young people of color or white to stand for what's real, we have to come into their life. Yeah. And we have to be the conduit that I had and that many of us had that brought us to this space. You know?
Can I just say how important it is to recognize that you can't fool children?
Yep.
And they don't do what
That's
you...
it.
Yes, yes.
They don't do what you tell them to do, but I just can't stress strong enough that parents, grandparents, and teachers, they do what we do. And they can sense adult hypocrisy and double messages. That's why we have to be so careful about what messages we convey around our dinner table, in our church circles, in our social life, and in our classrooms, because you cannot fool children.
That's it. And they pick it all up.
They pick it all up and they internalize it, and so watch out for adult hypocrisy.
So, Reverend Walker, this may be our last, maybe we'll take 1 or 2 more, but this one's for you. We Shall Overcome was a wonderful, heartfelt expression and symbol of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. But we have and need a new civil rights movement in our time. We need new symbols for this age. What new symbols can guide us in our struggle with racism, poverty, incarceration, lack of education, and white privilege?
New symbols.
New
That's a great
symbols.
question, and I'll let everybody.
Let everybody jump into this. That's a big question.
That's a deep one.
That is a deep one. I think if we pay attention to our young people, those symbols are being created as we speak. There's a song out of Selma, See Selma, called Glory.
Yeah, Glory.
And it's a beautiful song, and it's kind of a new, with a little rap and a little hip-hop, whatever, but it's beautiful. But I think these symbols are being created. I open this up to you guys because I don't have another answer.
I think that's what's going to happen. I mean, I think it's going to happen.
It's up to the younger generation, really.
The hoodie.
The hoodie.
The hoodie. It's one.
I was actually torn at one point whether or not to take a picture with it, and I debated because I said, "Is a bishop supposed to take a picture of the hoodie?" I suspect that the symbols are they're emerging. That's why we're having a hard time.
Right.
I don't think you can define them ahead of time. They are going to emerge.
Exactly.
Because I really do think there's a movement of something happening. I don't know exactly what all this means, but
there's something perking up.
There's something percolating up, and it's getting communicated on social media and other ways, and folk are showing up in flash mob ways, and the symbols are going to emerge. The songs may emerge, but I have to tell you, I suspect that the songs may actually go back to some of the songs that were sung before, because those songs have helped folk march before.
Yes.
And they may well emerge. The brilliance about that song, Glory, he really, it's a song that brings together hip hop, gospel, and Negro spirituals in one song, and talks about Jesus. It's incredible. I didn't even know who Common was before the meeting.
I have a question for you, Debbie. What are the most meaningful changes that we as individuals can make in our own selves and in the thinking, praying, and acting of our everyday lives to bring us closer together and closer in reality to the dream we all share?
I think the most important change ends up providing an umbrella for all the others, and that is to put collective well-being ahead of individual well-being.
Yes.
And for me, it's become really clear, and I actually learned this in my family. If someone in my family was hurting, we were all hurting. And we are all better off when we're all better off. So part of that putting collective well-being ahead of personal well-being includes getting over myself. You know, if somebody gives me some feedback and tells me, you know, you hogged so much airtime in that panel, and I say, well, I didn't mean to, and I get all defensive, that's me putting my self-image before really important information that's going to make me a better community member. So I think that being able to work in community means being able to let your ego drop way down.
One more question. There's so many others, but they're quite lengthy, and let's see if we can get to one more before we have to stop. This is from the what can I do perspective. Is friction a sign that you're transforming the system? How can you facilitate the discussion in the workplace if you work in a predominantly white environment to make awareness of white privilege?
Everyone's looking at me.
Anyone.
We're all looking.
Anyone.
Nobody wants that one.
Yeah.
I'll say something about that. I think the workplace, okay, I'm doing just what I said.
No.
But we want you to.
Okay, do you want me to?
Yeah, we want you to. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Please.
So the thing about the workplace that's difficult is that there are already power dynamics in the room.
Yeah.
And so it's really tricky. You know, who can speak up and not lose their job? I certainly saw this in teaching environments. And yet, it is important to not remain silent, and so finding ways to speak up. I think that in professional situations, the most important thing is to find out who knows what in your community. Who could you form alliances with? So if and when there is an issue to be raised, you're not raising it by yourself. And people have your back. They're not going to fire 5 people. They're not going to not promote all those people, so it's important to form alliances.
All right. Let's take one more quickly. Now, this could be long or short. We can make it short. The question reads, we have a new governor in Massachusetts who does not believe in funding early childhood education. What would you say to him?
You should make sure you say a lot to him.
That's a good.
That you educate him about the cost effectiveness and about the common senseness that these are the years of greatest brain development. Take Jack Shonkoff and all the experts now that Harvard has discovered, all these folks are saying this important thing. It is the best payoff on investment you can make. And the science is clear. And we absolutely have to educate him if they're not aware of it. So you go in there and you do whatever you have to do to get him to be educated. But I just want to give Dr. King my last words for the weekend, because again, I just feel so lucky to have been who I was when I was at the intersection of great events and great people. And I first heard him the first time in Spellman's Chapel, and there are 2 things that never left me that he said. One is that we say we're Christians, but that you take the first step, and if you can't see the whole stairway, just take the first step and leave the results to God. And we Christians need to kind of remember that, because I do want to have my short-term, medium-term, long-term strategy all mapped out, and we need to do as much of that as we can. But let's have faith and just do the right thing, even if you don't quite know where that will lead. And secondly, that he just stressed the importance of moving forward. And he stated it in very clear terms that if you can't fly, drive. If you can't drive, run. If you can't run, walk. and if you can't walk, crawl, but keep moving forward. And we are at that point in this country. I cannot state too much how dangerous this time is, and how people of faith and people who care about the future of this nation and the concept, the very concept of America, have to get out there and do more than due diligence, get out of our comfort zones, live our faith, and move this country forward. And you can start by moving your governor forward on early childhood. That's the one thing we can all do and move us forward.
Republican.
Please join me in offering sincere thanks to our panelists for this discussion.
Yes, indeed,
Really
indeed.
glad to connect with you.
Yeah, you're all great. Thank you, Barbara.
What's the easiest way to reach you?
Very nice.
Edelman at childrensdefense.org.
It was an
Just
honor to
call
be
me
with
a
you
message and I'll get
guys.
back to you. Okay? Really love
Thank
being
you.
with you.
Thank you.
You're terrific.
Oh, no, you are. You are. One more thing, please. Debbie Irving will be with us downstairs in the Common for a book signing immediately following the events here. And a second thing, please take a few minutes and complete the blue reflection sheet that you have available to you. It's in the back of your programs. While you do that, there'll be a musical interlude to accompany you. Please complete the reflections, and as you leave, you'll be rewarded with a gift from the anti-racism team. As you turn in your reflection sheet, you'll get a gift back. Thank you.
shepherd. I have all I need. She makes me lie down in green meadows. Beside the still waters she will lead. She restores my soul. She rights my wrongs. She leads me in a path of good things and fills my heart with songs. Even though I walk through a dark and dreary land, there is nothing that can shake me. She has said she won't forsake me. I'm in her hand. She sets a table before me in the presence of my foes. She anoints my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely, surely goodness and kindness will follow me all the days of my life, and I will live in her house forever, forever and ever. Glory be to the Mother and Son, and to the Holy of Holies, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
Is anyone tired? No. Another couple of hours and we'll get this thing figured out. What an afternoon. What an amazing exploration. I do feel myself this overload of emotion and frustration and passion and fear that it can't all happen. I don't know about you, but it's a lot to take in. I tried to capture some of the emotions that I was feeling around us, and a few would be something like anger and grief and rage and despair and determination and hope and fear, sadness, yearning, passionate desire for things to change. It all seemed to be swirling around, and we began to catch a glimpse of, oh, there's a plan, and, well, how do you start that? Or this could happen, but who's going to do that? Or what on earth can I do in the middle of this? And so that's where I think it leaves us, with some ringing lines in our ears. America is at risk. This is the worst time since slavery for the state of people of color in America. We need to be in a process of recovery, we white people, from our addiction to racism as a sustaining part of our lives. Race and poverty are inextricably intertwined. They go together. economic inequality is disastrous. We need to love justice enough to get to work, to protect our children, and to change this culture. Race is the backdrop behind so much that is ill among us. And so we heard so much, we felt so much, we saw the beginnings of a possibility, but what became clear was the fundamental beginning is personal transformation, personal commitment to take what steps we can take in our context and not to let this just go by. To find communities of collaboration, to find partners in this work, to find friends to support us and to keep us on the path. All of that is before us. Finding the concrete particulars that can sustain us in this work. We have heard the message loud and clear. Our nation is facing this grave blight, this undermining of our whole cultural life and the well-being of millions of people, and especially young people, with the reality we face. And so we will go to work. What we know is that nothing will change without personal transformation, without intentionality, without clarity that we will move forward, without a willingness to keep learning, without courage, without endurance, without hope, without trust that the Spirit of God is working in us now, as the Spirit has been working all through this day and afternoon onward. And now it's time for us, by the grace of God, to go where we don't know it will be, and to promise to work, and we don't know what those actions will be, but to promise that we will find our steps and allow the Spirit of God and the wisdom of our friends and companions to lead us along the way. And I invite you now to stand and join me in reading the prayer at the bottom of page 5 of our leaflet where the schedule was, a prayer that has become central to our own anti-racism task force, and it seemed to be the right note on which to close. Page 5 at the bottom of the schedule. And together. Let me not look away, O God, from any truth I should see. Even if it is difficult, let me face the reality in which I live. I do not want to live inside a cosseted dream, imagining I am the one who is always right, or believing only what I want to hear. Help me to see the world through other eyes, to listen to voices distant and different, and to educate myself to the feelings of those with whom I think I have nothing in common. Break the shell of my indifference, draw me out of my prejudices, and show me your wide variety. Let me not look away. Amen. Thank you again for being here, and Godspeed, and let's go forward.